Human rights are everywhere, and everybody loves them. Or do they? They're in the courts all the time. So just recently, there was a major headline about a court decision involving whether or not employers could ban religious or political symbols from the workplace, all argued on human rights grounds. Or they're everywhere in politics. When Donald Trump was elected, there were several European leaders, notably Angela Merkel, who made perhaps quite a pointed remark about the human rights values that bind us together. Or when we talk about horrendous events, such as what's going on in the Middle East, we describe it as human rights abuses. And then they're even involved, increasingly, in just day-to-day business. Increasingly, companies have a trend towards thinking about the human rights implications of their actions. There's a UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 2011 that's being worked out and thought about in boardrooms around the world. So everybody loves them, right? Not quite. Sometimes the media is not a huge fan. One of the perhaps most infamous Daily Mail headlines on this from a few years ago was titled, "When Human Rights Insult Us All," reporting on a case, a very sad case, when a very well-loved head teacher who'd been murdered found that the family found his murderer couldn't be deported because of his human rights. And lawyers, although we all say that we love them and are signed up to them, are sometimes a bit cynical about human rights. I don't know if you've ever heard the adage, when the facts are against you, argue the law. When the law is against you, argue the facts. And when the facts and the law are against you, just argue human rights. So we all are supposed to agree that human rights are a wonderful thing. They're talked about all the time. And yet sometimes they're not that popular, or we can be a bit cynical about them. What's the right way to think about human rights? So why do human rights matter, and where do they come from? Three things. Firstly, for us as Christians, they matter because they're real. We know that we're made in the image of God. And that idea of human beings made in the image of God means we're special, because God says we are. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament give us the idea of certain rights and responsibilities that human beings have towards one another. Secondly, because they are a tool, potentially, for doing great good. There are some wonderful organisations out there, including Christian organisations, who use human rights to achieve great good in the world, to rescue slaves from modern-day slavery, to prevent human trafficking, to stop the police being corrupt and abusive. And thirdly, because they are an increasingly powerful and dominant form of public discourse. In order to engage in arguments about what the good life is and what would be good for our society, you need to understand and be able to speak about human rights. So that's why they matter. Where have they come from? Well, human rights had their origin, in a simple sense at least, in two largely conflicting systems of thought. On the one hand, Judaism and Christianity, where God is in the centre. And on the other, the Enlightenment, where man was at the centre. And if we look at the history of human rights documents over the last few centuries, we see that tension being worked out. So perhaps the first and most famous human rights document is Magna Carta, back in 1215. But Magna Carta starts in a very God-centred way, with this. Know that before God, for the health of our soul and those of our ancestors and heirs, to the honour of God, the exaltation of the Holy Church and the better ordering of our kingdom, ... And then the rights are set out. That all changes with three revolutionary documents in the 17th and 18th centuries. First of all, the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Drafted in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where James II was overthrown and replaced by William of Orange, a constitutional monarch accountable to Parliament. This enshrined a number of basic freedoms: trial by jury, prohibition on torture, freedom of speech. The second revolutionary document, the American Declaration of Independence of 1776, famously declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And it's stated that these rights are from God, but not any specific God. In saying that, the American Declaration was drawing heavily on the Bill of Rights in 1689 and also the ideas of the English philosopher John Locke. He had argued from the idea of natural rights, the idea that in nature it was obvious that their human beings had certain rights and that government couldn't take them away. But then there's a third revolutionary document. In the French Revolution, there was produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789. This was as part of a new social order to replace a royal tyranny where people were oppressed by kings who lived in obscene luxury while their people starved. But in this context, the Christian idea behind human rights was jettisoned. The Roman Catholic Church was condemned as a major supporter of the tyranny. And so the French Declaration of the Rights of Man was a rejection of God and of the idea that there were any given authorities who were entitled to decide how we should live. So that's the original history. But then modern human rights began in the aftermath of the Second World War. After the horrors of Hitler and Stalin's regimes, with millions of people dehumanized and tortured and enslaved and exterminated, people said, this must never happen again. So a set of standards was agreed to which governments would be held accountable. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by all 48 members of the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948. And it was a remarkable achievement. But the preamble simply says this: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The Universal Declaration set out some wonderful provisions. And since then, there have been a great number of movements towards improving human rights protections. It's become international. It's become specific. So there are human rights documents on different aspects of human rights. And it's started to become enforced through courts, particularly in Europe. But notice that as all this work's going on to enforce and protect and specify what human rights are, the actual basis for human rights has become more and more watered down. It's gone from being a very specific statement linking human rights to the divine creator, the God who's made us, and in his image we live and breathe, to a vague reference to a God who's created us with nothing more, to no reference to God at all, and the right simply being asserted. And of course, the danger with this is that if you don't have a basis for human rights other than what man says, then man can take them away. So what's a Christian approach to human rights? Well, let's look and see what the Bible has to say. First of all, we've got Genesis chapter 1, 26 to 27, which we've already referred to. It says this: Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So the Bible tells us very clearly that all human beings of both sexes are made in the image of God. So they are hugely valuable. We are equal in dignity. And then the Bible also tells us repeatedly that there is a duty that those with power have to stand up for those who are weak. Have a look, for instance, at Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Here in the West, at least, we forget so easily how radical an idea this is. Before Christianity came on the scene, in the Greek and Roman world, philosophers and thinkers looked around and saw that people were different. Some people were slaves, some were free. Some were men, some were women. Some were children, some were adults. Some were weak or disabled, some were strong and fit. And they reached the fairly obvious conclusion that people are different and therefore have different value. Christianity exploded onto that and turned it upside down. with the revolutionary idea that in fact every single person has equal dignity and equal value. Here's the historian and writer Tom Holland, who specialises in ancient history, writing in September 2016. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take it for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It's why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. So Christianity gives us a very firm foundation for the idea of equal human dignity and the need to protect the God-given rights of the vulnerable in particular. But Christianity also warns us that that's not enough to base our entire society or moral code on, and that God's ultimately in control. The Bible repeatedly tells us that God is sovereign. We have no rights against God. And the Bible, especially in the New Testament, also repeatedly tells us that a human rights idea isn't enough to capture what ethics should be about. The Christian ethic is profoundly unselfish. It's not about standing on my own rights, but about giving up my rights for the good of others. And the ultimate Christian virtue, love, simply can't be captured in rights language. So how should Christians engage with human rights, or use human rights, if we're lawyers? Well, the first thing I want to do is tell us pretty clearly that human rights can't save the world. I know that might come as a shock to some of you. I was an idealistic young lawyer once who thought that they could. But of course they can't. Because ultimately, the problem in the world isn't lack of human rights. It's human beings themselves. We only need human rights because human beings do so much wrong. And the reason is sin. Sin, a rebellion against God, is our greatest problem. And more specifically, God's anger at that sin. So when we think about human rights, it should drive us to praise Jesus, who's the solution and who has saved the world. But it's not just that human rights can't save the world, they also don't actually work for everything. Not every legal argument, not every political argument. Here's 2 good examples just from the last few years. Assisted suicide. In the assisted suicide debate in Parliament a couple of years ago, arguments based on human rights were a key plank of the proposers' case. In particular, they asserted the idea of a right to die at the time and in the manner one chooses. Somewhat ironically, given that there is no right to die in any of the international human rights documents, and instead there's a right to life. But reliance on individual autonomy was the big idea. On the other hand, the arguments of those who opposed assisted suicide, which were thankfully successful, were based on ideas and principles that actually aren't captured easily in the idea of rights. Concerns to protect vulnerable people from themselves. The importance of declaring as a society that we value all human life. And the possibility of tempering justice with mercy on individual cases. So that debate was a very good example of how human rights aren't the end of the story, or even the central narrative, when it comes to a complex, sensitive matter of public policy. Perhaps even better example, Brexit. The Brexit debate was all about nationhood, sovereignty, economics, and what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be global, European, both? How much immigration is good? Does it matter if Parliament isn't ultimately in charge of everything? None of that can be captured in the concept of human rights. So if human rights aren't the be-all and end-all, they can't save the world, and they're not the way to talk about everything, how should we approach them? Well, let me give you some bad news first, but then the really good news. The bad news. Firstly, let's avoid, as Christian lawyers, having too high a view of human rights. They aren't, and never will be, a comprehensive means of resolving disputes or articulating morality. And to the extent that they're an attempt to create values for a godless age, to quote one book, they're an attempt to design systems of values without reference to God, which are doomed to failure. Secondly, we should avoid weaponising human rights. James Orr, an Oxford philosopher, says, I think very well, that the problem with human rights is nothing to do with rights themselves, which are good, but the fact that they become weaponised. Instead of becoming tools used to navigate the complexities of a shared common life, they become armaments deployed to assert my good over yours. And that is always a potential problem with the idea of rights. As the great Oxford philosopher from the last century, H.L.A. Hart, said, rights are typically conceived of as possessed or owned by or belonging to individuals. So translated into the language of the street, it comes to this. Human rights are mine. They're things that belong to me. And this idea of human rights as things that are mine emphasises individualism at the expense of community. Arguments become all about me and my rights. It leads to an emphasis on possessiveness. So rights are seen as things I own, and I want to get as many of them as possible. It's what comes out in slogans like, I know my rights, or it's my body so I can do what I like with it. And the third result is that whenever we find ourselves in conflict with another person or another group, we're tempted to go legal. Instead of trying to find a practical compromise, disputes can just immediately become an argument about rights, and all other dimensions of the relationship get forgotten about. And that individualism and possessiveness creates a view that other people in society are just my rivals and social institutions exist to fulfill my needs. And when they don't, the solution is appeal to the government or appeal to the courts to vindicate my rights. So human rights being weaponised can lead to people seeing themselves primarily just as individuals with demands and needs, rather than as contributors to society with responsibilities to care for others and great gifts to share with others. This isn't something that's come out of the blue. Writing as long ago as 1978, the Soviet Christian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "The defence of individual rights can reach such extremes as to make society as a whole defenceless. It's time to defend not so much human rights as human obligations." So let's avoid weaponising human rights. But then here's the good news. Remember that they are good. Human rights are a very useful means of seeking to address two fundamental concerns. First of all, the danger of dehumanising certain people or groups. And secondly, the tyranny of government. Many of the atrocities that took place in the 20th century that led to modern human rights being created and formulated happened because the perpetrators convinced themselves that their victims were just not really human beings who counted, that they were worth less than them. In biblical terms, they denied or suppressed the truth that all human beings are made in the image of God. And the idea of human rights is one way, and a very effective way, of affirming that. But human rights is also a very effective means of checking the power of government. They are a tool which can enable judges to make decisions about whether a government is mistreating people or abusing its powers. And they are a very effective way to restrain the overreach of government. They're not the only means. Long before human rights was come up with, the common law developed alternative mechanisms such as habeas corpus or the principle of the rule of law. But they are a powerful one, and used rightly, can achieve great good. So let's have a balanced approach to human rights as Christians. We've got a great foundation for them. They are a good thing. But we don't need to make them the be-all and end-all. And as a result, we can avoid the dangers of weaponising them or of thinking they're going to save us and everyone else.